All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on today's call and webinar. We're giving this webinar thing a shot. Please bear with us with the technology. Hopefully, everything works out fine. But we'll see how it goes. I think it should be fine. I'm John Newer, Communications Director for the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. And before we get started, I also wanted to give my contact information in case anyone had questions after the call. You have technical issues and you're for some reason unable to ask a question, but you have one. You can call me at 724-903-0077, 724-903-0077. Or you can email me at neurohr, NEUROHR, at pennbpc.org, PENNBPC.org, and we'll take care of whatever you need after the call. Today, the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center is releasing a fair share tax proposal for Pennsylvania, highlighting a suite of revenue options that would close Pennsylvania's looming structural deficit and allow for additional funding to invest in things like public education, human services, protecting the environment, and many other things that could be on the chopping block if legislators refuse to acknowledge the need for new revenues. On the call today, the co-authors of the report, Marc Stier, who is the director of the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center, and Stephen Herzenberg, who is the executive director of the Keystone Research Center. They're going to walk through an explanation of the budgetary problem the state is facing, and then they'll explain the components of this new report. A couple quick housekeeping items. All lines are on mute right now, except for Mark and Steve and myself. If you have a question, you can click the raise your hand icon on the webinar pane. If you see that there, I'll get a note and we'll be able to unmute you first after when we get to question and answer at the end. The other thing that we'll do, if you're only on your phone, for example, at the very end, I'm going to unmute all lines so you can ask your question if you are unable to click that raise your hand button on the webinar pane. So we'll make sure that if you're on the line, you have a question, that you get that question answered. The other thing I wanted to note is that we are recording this call. So I just wanted everybody to know that. We'll have a link afterwards to the video and the audio of the call. And you should have an embargoed version of the report if you RSVP'd for the call, but the final report is now available at pennbpc.org. But I also tried to add it as a handout for this webinar. So on your webinar pane, you should see a link to a PDF of the report. But if not, it's available at pennbpc.org. I am going to share my screen now. So hopefully everybody is able to see. And I'm going to turn the call over to the director of the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center, Marc Stier. Marc?
Thanks, John. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go through some of the background to the current situation, the deficit that we all know exists and where it came from, why we have it. And then I'm going to turn this conference call over to Steve Herzenberg, who's going to talk to you about our proposals for dealing with it. So let's go to the first slide with the deficit, John. You've seen these numbers before. They're from the IFO. They're a little different than the more public numbers that the IFO has been putting out, because what it does is includes the human service spending. That's the result of higher caseloads than initially projected, both for 16-17, 17-18, and for subsequent years. You'll see that we have arrows pointing to this year's budget, 2016-17 and 2017-18. That's about a total of $3 billion that we have to close by the end of the current fiscal year, when the next fiscal year begins. We need legislation to raise another $3 billion, or to cut $3 billion from the combined budget of this year and next year to eliminate the deficit. And that's, as you know, a very heavy lift. So why do we have a deficit? If we go to the next slide, we can see that the problem is basically not a problem of growing state expenditures. You can see that the trend line for both expenditures and revenues has been downwards since 1994. If you summarize some of this data, you'll see that the average expenditures as a percentage of the state's gross domestic product from 1994 to 2011 was about 4.7%. Revenues were a little higher at 4.9%. In the Corbett years, expenditures dropped to 4.3%, revenues dropped to 4.5%. In the two Wolf years, expenditures have stayed at about 4.3% of state's gross domestic product. Revenues have dropped a little further. And if you look at the IFO's projections, the years beyond the dotted line, you'll see that there's a slight increase in expenditures to about 4.5%, which is still below the historic average under both Democratic and Republican governors before 2011. And revenues keep dropping down to about 4.3%. So the problem is not that the state is spending a lot more money. We are, in fact, as a percentage of gross domestic product, despite inflation, despite a growing population, we are spending actually a little less. So the problem really is on the revenue side, and we can take a look at the next slide to see the biggest source of the long-term problem. The long-term problem is we're declining corporate taxes. Back in 1972, they brought in 30% of all general fund revenues. They're down to about 16 to 70% right now. If you take a mid-year, say 2002, 2003, when corporate taxes brought in 22.5% of all general fund revenues, and you project that to the current year, we would have an additional $2.4 billion in revenues for the current year. Not only would we not have a deficit, but we'd have a substantial surplus, or we could be investing more in education and human services, protecting the environment, putting away more money for a rainy day in case there's another recession. So the long-term issue is that corporate tax cuts have taken place. We've eliminated one whole form of corporate taxation. We've cut up the corporate net income tax, and we're not bringing enough revenue as a result to pay for the level of service that Pennsylvanians have come to expect. There's also a short-term problem, and I think many of you are well aware of that. Over the last 3 years, the state has continued to solve its yearly deficit problem with a mix of some recurring revenues and a lot of one-shot revenues. Last year, of the $1.3 billion in revenue, new revenue raised for this year, 2016-17, of the $1.3 billion new revenues raised, half of it was recurring revenue, although a lot of that recurring revenue was in fact taxes on tobacco, which tend to bring in less revenue over time as people adjust their smoking habits as a result of the higher cost of smoking. The other half was non-recurring revenue, including a tax amnesty, including licenses to sell liquor in new places, including gaming licenses, and including borrowing from other funds. The medical malpractice fund lent the general fund roughly $200 million. At some point, that has to be paid back. When we put off the day of reckoning by not raising recurring revenues that generate new and growing revenues year after year, we are basically forcing the state into a continuing crisis. And that's where we find ourselves right now with a continuing crisis. So how do we get around the crisis? If we go to the next slide, you'll see the distribution of tax burden today. We have an upside-down tax system that takes far more from people with lower incomes than people with high incomes. The lowest 20%, 12% of people's incomes go to state and local taxes. In the middle, 10.3%, but in the top 1% only pay 4.2% of their family incomes in taxes. The last thing we at the PBPC and KRC want to do is see new taxes on working people in the middle class. We think their taxes are higher than they should be relative to those at the upper ends of the income scale. And we all know that over the last 20 years, incomes have been fairly stagnant for working people in the middle class, while incomes for the very rich have been rising quite substantially. So the question is, how do we fix our tax system? How do we fix the broken tax system that takes too little from the top and too much from the bottom? That's always been a difficult thing in Pennsylvania because, as many of you know, we have a uniformity clause that prevents us from having graduated tax rates on any one class of income. But what we've tried to do in this fair share tax plan for Pennsylvania is figure out a number of ways to sidestep the uniformity clause and to create a new tax model that takes more from those with upper incomes and less from those with low incomes, that not only raises new revenues but does so while fixing our broken tax system. I'm going to turn this over to Steve Herzenberg now, who's going to talk about what's in that plan.
Thanks very much, Mark. So Mark has explained in the previous chart how unfair the Pennsylvania tax system is currently, and also explained that a central reason for that is that Pennsylvania currently has a flat income tax that asks multimillionaires to pay only the same 3.07% of their income as families with incomes of $40,000. So that flat income tax fails to compensate for sales and property taxes that fall more heavily as a share of income on the middle and low income Pennsylvanians, together with corporate tax cuts, which exacerbates the tendency for folks at the higher end to pay a lower share of their income in taxes. You get that picture Mark showed you. But Mark also indicated that there's a way to address this. While many Pennsylvanians think that the Constitution requires Pennsylvania to have our current flat income tax, that's not in fact true. The Constitution only requires that we have a flat or uniform tax rate on each kind or class of income, of which there are 8. Thus, the heart of PBPC's revenue-raising proposal in the paper being introduced today is to raise the tax rate on 6 kinds of income that primarily go to upper income earners, kinds of income such as dividends and capital gains. So if you raise that to the rate on those 6 kinds of income to 4.5%, you can get $1.2 billion, which is nearly half of the income from the overall proposal we introduced in this paper. And you mostly leave folks in the middle and in the bottom untouched. Next slide, please, John. So this chart, and I should thank our good friends in Washington, D.C. at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy who modeled this tax change for us using their Pennsylvania tax model. And what you see here in this bar chart is that folks at the top pay much more of the increase in income associated with a 4.5% tax rate on what we call income from wealth. So folks in the middle 20%, you see that $48 little bar there, that's less than $1 a week for folks in the middle. And then the bottom fifth, that's $6, people are paying about 11 cents more a week. Next slide, please, John. Okay, and then here's the actual numbers that are also shown earlier on the chart. Next slide, please, John. Okay, so here is our overall proposal. And I should say that this PowerPoint presentation that Marc Stier and I have been going through is a shortened version of a PowerPoint that's available on the PBPC webpage immediately after this call. So some of the other points that Marc Stier made and some elaboration on these points is available in that longer PowerPoint. This table here does show an overall increase in income of nearly $2.6 billion. And down the line, we are doing what we can to be creative to limit the impact of higher revenues on middle and low income Pennsylvanians. So for example, we do propose a modest broadening of the sales tax, but mostly to entertainment services that are predominantly consumed by folks at the upper end of the income scale. And also we offset that with a new proposed low income sales tax credit. We also propose the severance tax, using the Wolf administration's estimate of what that would raise about a year ago when the gas prices, were low, which they still are relatively low. Ultimately, think that would raise more money, but we're being conservative in this estimate. And then at the end, one way to address the decline in corporate revenues, corporate tax revenues as a share of total general fund revenues, is to close corporate tax loopholes that benefit mostly very large corporations that can manipulate their bottom line subject to the corporate net income tax in Pennsylvania. So we propose closing those loopholes through combined reporting and lowering the tax rate initially to 8.99%. We think it could be lowered significantly more, but and are only looking to bake into our overall proposal $200 million in additional revenue from the corporate net income tax. So the bottom line here is representatives of both parties in the past several years have expressed great concern about the potential impact of raising revenues on middle and low-income Pennsylvanians who already pay too big a share of Pennsylvania taxes. The good news from our brief is that we can raise revenue to fix the structural deficit and fund education, human services, the environment, job creation, while sparing most Pennsylvanians. With that, I'll turn things back to John Nura, and I think he'll walk you through how we're going to do Q&A. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Steve. And before we go to questions, well, let me explain again how we'll do questions, and then I'm going to quickly ask the first question of you, Steve. But there's a button that folks should see on their screen to raise your hand. Then I can unmute you to ask your question. We'll do that in just a second. But Steve, one thing, can you walk through quickly the reasoning for including the increase in the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour? It's sort of, can you walk through where we find that 225 million revenue? That I'm just maybe preempting a question that folks are interested in.
Sure. And I was, again, trying to spare people too many weeds, so thanks for raising that question, John. The minimum wage, raising the minimum wage helps the state budget in a couple ways. One way is that it does raise families' incomes, and therefore it increases tax revenues, sales and income tax revenues. The second is it bumps, currently, Medicaid is paid mostly sort of 50-50 roughly by the state and the federal government up to the old eligibility threshold. But since Pennsylvania, starting under Governor Corbett and then in a modified way under Governor Wolf, since Pennsylvania accepted Medicaid expansion, basically people are eligible for Medicaid at higher incomes. So what happens when you increase the minimum wage is you bump people above the old eligibility threshold. But rather than people actually losing Medicaid now, what happens instead is they go into the range where the federal government pays more like 90% of the cost. So that's a savings to the state for that reason. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Steve. So what I'm going to do in just a second, so here's a warning, is I'm going to unmute all of the lines. So if you are somewhere that is loud, for example, and you don't have a question, if you can mute your own phone also ahead of me unmuting, I thought that might be easier if we just unmute everybody, and if anyone has a question, they can jump in. I also want to reiterate that the report is both available as a handout on the webinar panel right now. You should be able to click that, but if that doesn't work for some reason, then you can get that at penbpc.org. It's live on the site right now. Okay, so I'm going to unmute everybody, and we will see how this plays out. So just give me 1 second. I'm muting. Yeah. As expected, but that's all right. All right, so everybody should be unmuted. So if anyone has a question, feel free to jump in. Going once, going twice. All right, I am going to remute everybody. Just some housekeeping again to close things up. Thanks for joining the call today. We know everybody's busy. It's a very busy time of year, so we appreciate you getting on. If you have any follow-up questions afterwards, give me a call, 724-903-0077. You can also email me at neurohr@penbpc.org. This webinar, which was recorded, will be available at the same place that the PowerPoint slides will be available, which is on our website at penbpc.org. Just click into the report page. We'll have links at the bottom of the page there for everything. But if you can't find it and you need anything, feel free to get in touch with me, and we'll get you whatever you need. Thank you very much for joining the call today, and we'll be in touch. Thanks so much, folks.